Howard woke to find himself being lifted from his playpen to be slung over her right hip. He looked sleepily at his new vantage point. She had settled him square on top of the ridge of her pelvis with one leg on either side of her. If he turned his head, his chin just touched the top of her breast. Rose put her hand under his bottom and held him close as she carried him into the kitchen. Howard thought that being carried that way by a woman was delightful. Aside from the obvious attraction of being held so that his head was next to her ample tit, he enjoyed the sensation of having his pubes in contact with her side and the feeling of having her hand on his butt. As she walked, her natural feminine sway made the bones in her hip pushed rhythmically against his crotch, simulating the slow cadence that Howard used when he first mounted a woman to make love. His position on her hip was agreeably similar to some of the odd sexual maneuvers he had seen graphically depicted in the Kama Sutra. Howard sighed and lay his head against her breast, closing his eyes with a tiny contented rosebud smile on his lips. It wasn't the same as having sex with the lovely young woman, but it was as close as a man with a 1-year-old body was going to get. When they got to the kitchen, Rose reached around and grasped him with both hands on either side of his chest, then hoisted him over the tray of the high chair to ease him into its seat. Once she was sure he was comfortable, she stepped behind the high chair and snapped his soft plastic bib around his neck. Rose pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and turned it so it faced the high chair, then placed the feeding spoon on the tray in front of Bree while she unscrewed the lid from the baby food jar. Howard stared at the tiny blue latex-covered spoon in front of him in fascination. There was something about its appearance that was so intriguing that he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. Rose suddenly remembered the cooling bottle of formula and went to get it from the stove, leaving the jar and lid on the table. Seizing the opportunity, Howard grabbed the spoon to look at it more closely. The rubber coating on the spoon ended at the juncture of the handle and the bowl of the spoon. Howard puzzled over why he had never noticed the odd construction of the spoon before and idly wondered how the rubber would feel against the surface of his tongue. Without conscious volition, his nimble hands popped the spoon in his mouth to get the feel of the thing. The smooth rubber of the spoon felt wonderful in his mouth. He moved it from side to side, rubbing it on the inside of his cheeks and exploring the odd sensation of tying a soft spoon with absolutely no sharp edges on it. He closed his eyes to concentrate on the strange feelings the spoon gave him and never saw Rose return to her seat in front of the high chair. Howard was jerked out of his reverie by Rose's exclamation, "No, no, Bree. Not for baby." She reached over the tray and grasped his hand, pulling the spoon out of his mouth as she said, "Give Rosie the spoon, sweetie. Rosie doesn't want you to choke yourself on the spoon." Howard looked at her in shock and realized what he had just done. Without thinking about it, he had started mouthing and sucking on the spoon like a 1-year-old. Howard was mortified. He was acting like an infant. Suddenly, Howard became aware of his surroundings and how he was dressed in front of the beautiful stranger. There he was, dressed in nothing but a diaper and feeding bib while sitting in a baby's high chair, and he had to go and act like he hadn't a brain in his head. No wonder everyone treated him like an infant. He would have given his eye teeth for the opportunity to fuck the comely young woman, and the stupid infantile reflexes of his rejuvenated body had made him behave in a ridiculously infantine manner. It was enough to make a grown man cry. When Rose forcibly unwrapped his tiny fingers from the spoon's handle effortlessly, Howard became aware of just how weak and helpless he had become. Waves of frustration and anger washed over him, engulfing his conscious mind in emotion and drowning his self-control. Howard began to cry. When the high-pitched wails reached his ears, the infantile sound of his voice only made him more frustrated. Howard began kicking his legs in helpless rage at his circumstances and balled his fists in anger. Rose smiled calmly and shook her head at Bree's temper tantrum as she ladled out a spoonful of mixed vegetables for him. Apparently, little Bree didn't like having his new toy taken away from him. Well, she knew how to calm him quickly enough. He was probably cranky because he was hungry. Once she got some food into him and gave him his bottle, he'd be all right. Since his mouth was already wide open, there was no reason to wait to feed him, she thought as she pushed the spoon in his mouth and dumped its contents under his tongue. Howard's wails of anger stopped in mid-screech when he realized that she had put food in his mouth. He closed his jaw to swallow, but his slack lips and the unaccustomed position of the food under his tongue rather than on top of it made him lose most of the spoonful down his chin. Howard was horrified by the thought of how he must look to her. The humiliation of having food drip from his chin pulled Howard back to reality. What had happened to him? He had felt frustrated and suddenly he was having a temper tantrum like an infant. What had happened to his self-control? Seconds later, Rose dropped another spoonful in his mouth to join the first. Howard swallowed convulsively and opened his mouth for the next. There was no point in resisting his babysitter, she'd just continue to feed him and he'd end up with food all over him. He let her feed him the rest of the jar without answer and sat still when she wiped his face and hands with a warm wet washcloth. When she took the bottle and pushed the nipple in his mouth, he began crying again. Rose took the bottle and set it on the table for a moment, then pulled him up and out of the high chair to ride on her hip. Taking the bottle in her free hand, she took him back to the living room and sat on the couch. Rose took care to arrange him in the crook of her arm so he was nearly flat and tried the bottle once more. This time, Howard's rational mind retained control and he allowed her to stick the nipple in his mouth so he could nurse. He tried to put his hands up to hold the bottle, but they were firmly and gently brushed away by Rose. Apparently, Rose thought that he was too young to be trusted to hold his own bottle. Within seconds, Howard's thirst and infantile reflexes took over and he was sucking on the bottle as hard as he could. He looked up around the bottle and gazed into Rose's loving eyes. Despite the embarrassment of being bottle-fed like a baby, Howard was comfortable in her lap. It was easier to keep his short legs folded than it was to stretch them out, so he let them stay folded over him, only occasionally waving them languidly while he suckled. The food and formula was making Howard sleepy. His eyelids drooped as he sucked while the blood vessels in his skin vasodilated, making him feel warm and cozy. Howard was surprised by how warm his crotch felt in particular. The warmth seemed to grow every minute, creeping across his behind until his entire bottom was wrapped in a comfy glow. Howard felt a small tingle of pleasure radiate from his perineum, making him relax even more. A faint smell wafted by Howard's nose and was drawn in his nostrils. Howard's eyes snapped open in immediate recognition of the aroma of baby poop. He had shit his diapers while sitting on Rose's lap. Oh God. Oh God. Please no, Howard thought in horror when he realized he had just shat while sitting on a gorgeous girl's lap.